session is going to be around this topic here. Who cares, and whether or not caring has a cost to it, both in terms of sort of emotional cost or physical cost or financial cost and so on. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And as I've already just briefly said, my name is Chris Smethurst and I'm co-director of the Institute of Education, Health and Social Sciences. So I'm going to ask people who may well be watching this what they think are the most important skills and qualities for people doing these jobs that I'm going to list in a minute. And also to ask themselves, are they the same for all the jobs, or is there a difference between the different kinds of jobs? So let's have a look at what we got here. So a nurse. Now, just to whoever's watching this, what do you think are the most important skills and qualities that a nurse should have? Just give it a few seconds. Just think that through. What about a nursery teacher, somebody who works in an early years setting? What do you think the skills and qualities are that they should have? If we move on, what about an engineer? Is that different? Do engineers need something different in terms of qualities, personality traits than say a nurse or a nursery school teacher? And then what about a police officer? What about them? A couple of seconds to think about that. Well, this question really exercised the mind of a very famous American sociologist called Arlie Hochschild. She wrote a book, actually the first edition was back in 1983, called The Managed Heart, which she did her research in the 70s, the late 1979, I think her first articles were published in this area. And she was very interested in what is it that people do in these particular jobs, and what is it that's on that's part and parcel of the sort of the job requirements, but isn't necessarily the thing you get on a job description or a person specification. And so she started out by looking at what do cabin crew do. And she was looking again in the 1970s, and the terms that were used in those days might seem a bit sexist for us today, because they would be known as stewardesses and air hostesses and things like that. And the clue is that in those days, the majority of people who were cabin crew were women, probably still the case now. And she was but Arlie Hochschild was quite interested in what is it that they do. Is it these sort of things that we might see that are more visible when we go on our holidays? Is it the selling of duty frees, doing the health and safety aspects, all the things you hear when you say doors to manual and the safety briefings and all of that? Or is there some other things that are less obvious, perhaps a bit more intangible? And that's what Hochschild was really focusing in on. And she thought, yes, there was. And she said that a lot of the time, a lot of the work of stewardesses, as you would have called them in those days, but certainly a lot of the work of female cabin crew was devoted to managing the emotions of other people. So distressed passengers, people who were irritated and upset or anxious about flying, dealing with other people's children, but also always presenting that professional face to the world. So I put that little picture there, which is a Pan American advert from the Pan American was an American airline from the 1960s. And you've got that kind of fixed smile on the face. So Hochschild was kind of interested in that bit about the sort of emotional management aspect, so much so that she came up with this term emotional labor. And it's really come to prominence fairly recently. So it was, again, perhaps the focus of sociologists and a few sort of people who were writing about organizational behavior for many years. but really it's kind of exploded on the public consciousness a bit more. But her definition, which she coined in 1983, was to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward countenance, that's the face, that produces the proper state of mind in others. Now, there are all kinds of things that spin off from that nowadays. We might think about emotional intelligence, as well as things like emotional labour, being professional, all of those things, all that kind of umbrella terms that you might use. But really, what Hochschild was focusing in on was this bit about managing other emotions, but also putting on that professional face to the world. Now, a lot of that, I think, is encapsulated in this advert from 1969. And you can see that's an American cabin crew from American Airlines in the 60s, and it's kind of encapsulated in that phrase there that passengers were invited to think of this member of staff as their mother, with all of that goes, all that's behind that. Now, I might just ask you again a couple of seconds to think about what sort of skills and qualities do you associate with being a mother. I'll just give a couple of seconds to think about that and I'll come back to it. So what Hochschild was interested in was, again, this notion of cabin crew being perceived as nurturing, as caring of others, and of looking after other people, of again being professional, but also dealing with other people's upsets and always being calm and always being steady and always being professional. And what Hochschild highlighted is she thought that these are absolutely integral parts of the role. So when I asked you the question right at the beginning, what do you think the skills and qualities are of these various occupations? That's what Hochschild was focusing in on. So you might come up with a slightly different, you might not have done, but you might have come up with a slightly different set of skills and qualities for somebody who works in nursing or in nursery education than you did for an engineer. So you might call those people skills. But if you start drilling down to what that means, again, you know, nursery teacher, somebody who is good with children, able to read when children are upset, able to deal with children who are upset or irritated or happy and so on, being able to be that kind of nurturing figure. Similarly, for nurses, historically, we might have seen that nurses a central part of being a nurse, well, what we might call as having a bedside manner, being nurturing and caring and so on. And that will perhaps seem to be going hand in hand with what you might call the more technical skills, which is the understanding of medical conditions, being able to do injections and all those other things that you probably see nurses doing, you know, if not in a hospital or in a surgery, but certainly on the TV. Now, so Hochschild was saying, so if these are important bits of the role for nurses and people who work in nursing, so what about the police? What about engineers? Well, she would probably have concluded that engineers don't necessarily require that level of people skill, perhaps, arguably. But certainly police officers perhaps needed a different set of skills to do with emotion. Now, what Hochschild said is that police officers might require the ability, again, to be stoic. She would use that word stoic. So the ability not to be, to always to be, appear professional and unfazed and calm, and to be able to deal with aggression and so on in a way that really battened down their emotions. So she thought that as being slightly different. But the central bit for her is that she thought that emotional labour related very much to the gender of particular occupations. So, for example, occupations that traditionally employed women, for example, nursing, cabin crew, nursery workers, etc., might need a different skill set or a different to occupations that traditionally employed men. And so, and she felt that that wasn't recognised, even though those were, you would say, you would expect a nurse to be caring and to be good with other people's emotions and to be able to manage their own emotions. You expect that from a nurse, you would expect that from a nursery worker, but you wouldn't necessarily perhaps see it in the job specification. You might see particular skills or knowledge and some kind of behaviours, but not necessarily those. And Hochschild's belief was that there were certain occupations that traditionally employed women where emotional labour was taken for granted. Now, she used this term emotional labour because she said it is work like anything else. It is work just as much as doing health and safety briefings or all the other various tasks that are easily identifiable for cabin crew. It's work like anything else, but it doesn't get recognised, and it doesn't get taken, and to an extent it gets taken for granted because it's assumed that women are good at this stuff, that women by definition are better than men. Occupations that traditionally employed men, like the military, and this we talk about 70s and 80s here, let's remember, were focused very much on that emotional suppression of being strong and appearing tough. Now, you might think that's a bit old-fashioned. So we're going to look and move things forward to see. So so has that changed, but also what would be the costs? Going back to my original slide, what would be the costs and consequences of emotional labour? So this question here, is it taken for granted and is it gendered? Well, again, with my love of retro adverts, you can see here, this view of women as the traditionally nurturing and caring individuals. This, what Hochschild would say, was translated into the workplace. So occupations that, again, traditionally employed women, everything from working in retail through cabin crew, nursing, a lot of health related professions, a lot of front of house occupations relied on what she called this emotional labour, but it was taken for granted because it was just assumed that women are good at it. So we fast forward a few years to look at moving away from just the professional sphere, what happens at work, to look at the domestic sphere, what happens in the home. Now, a couple of people who used to work here, Duncan and Marston, now retired, did some research in the 1990s, and they took this idea of emotional labour and started to look at what happens at home, and they coined this term women's triple shift, because again they felt that women did the majority of the managing of emotions and caring for people in the family sphere. So they said, well, this is, again, if you look at that in terms of what women are expected to do, they said that women are undertaking this triple shift. So they're combining, and again, retro photos here, if you look at from the left to the right, they're combining work, paid work. They're doing the majority of the domestic chores, but they're also doing the majority of the caring and emotion work within the family. So that's what they were thinking of in the 90s, women's triple shift. And that was quite an influential idea, and has informed some of the research that's taken place more recently, which again, moving forward another 15, 20 odd years, just looking at how things have changed and how much they haven't changed. Duncan and Marston's original ideas still have quite a degree of traction today. There's still quite a bit of interest in them. So let's have a look. Let's move it forward and also see, why does it matter? So let's have a look at the impact. What is the impact of managing your own emotions and other people's emotions? Now, this is where things like sociology and psychology converge, because there's quite a lot of research around neuroscience, looking at empathy and things like that. And that's converged with looking at kind of the sociological impact or the sociological consequences of emotional labour. So let's go back and look at our example of a nurse. Okay. Now, there's been recent research here by Cottingham and Erickson, who said that emotional labour linked to people feeling very, very tired and exhausted at the end of the day. So, I mean, I've often asked this question of groups when I've worked with them previously, and I usually say something along the lines of, have you ever got to the end of the day? Have you ever been working really hard and got to the end of the day and gone, you know what, I've achieved nothing. I've actually not done anything that's on my to-do list. I've not done any of the tasks that I'm perhaps being measured to perform, but I'm feeling really, really tired. Now, this again relates to what Hochschild was talking about, because she noted this idea of kind of emotional exhaustion, emotional burnout. And when I talk to groups when I ask that question, what they'll often say is, yeah, they do. And what's kind of got in the way is they spend the entire day either talking to people, dealing with problems that are not just kind of practical problems, but dealing with problems that get thrown up, which require this emotional self-awareness and emotional management. And that is really, really tiring. And I guess anybody who's watching this, if you think about, if you're if you're the sort of person your friends come to talk to when they got problems, and you might welcome that, you might be good at it, you might think, oh, that's really nice that people can talk to me. Or even if I'm the person in the family that people always turn to, that's really great, that's brilliant, I quite like that. But actually, you know what, sometimes I get really tired of it, and sometimes it's really just draining. And so that's what Cottingham and Erickson highlighted in relation to nursing, that dealing with, you think about it, if you're working in the health professions, you're dealing with people who are distressed, they're ill, and they're upset, they're anxious, and you're having to manage that, and you're having to support them and be nurturing and caring. When you perhaps sometimes don't really feel like it, not really surprising then that you might get really tired at the end of the day, is it? Now, the other thing, another sort of branch of research, again looking at nursing, highlighted, I mean, it's Elliot and others, looked at the way in which uh, emotional labour, again, as we've defined it, relates to stress. Can create anxiety in people, can create people feeling that they can't do enough, that they feel that they're being torn in different directions, that they're being asked to do too many things. And that relates back to what Duncan and Marsden were saying about the women's triple shift, because they were specifically focusing on women being torn in different directions, not just the fatigue aspect of being tired out at the end of the day, of not only doing sort of paid work, domestic chores, but also taking the bulk of the responsibility for the emotional well-being of the family. It wasn't just feeling tired, but feeling stressed about it, feeling they couldn't do enough, feeling that they were somehow, inadequate in some ways, people feeling guilty. So again, that's another strand to consider. Now, a lot of this research that I talked about really predated what we know about modern neuroscience. So there are a couple of interesting areas that I just want to highlight. And this isn't necessarily strictly sociology. It does inform what we're talking about. And the first thing is something that you might have noticed yourselves. In fact, you will notice. In fact, I'm going to ask you that next time you're with a group of people, just to look out for it. And it's called emotional contagion. Now, emotional contagion really is easily defined as when one person feels something, other people start to pick it up. And so you might have noticed that in a group of friends, or in a group of at college or at school, whereby a group of people have a sort of collective mood. Or if one person's really upset, other people start to feel a bit upset. Or if you got one person who's really high, the life and soul of the party, it lifts the mood of the rest of the group. That's emotional contagion in action. And the reason, well, part of the reason for emotional contagion, part of the reason it operates, is because human beings, we're social animals. We're used to living in groups. And so consequently, we do a lot of this emotional work, emotional labour, automatically, because we're kind of hardwired to pick up how other people are feeling and respond to it. Now this is, I've checked to make sure this is absolutely fine in terms of copyright. But this little cartoon illustrates the fact that you can see the dog on the left starts feeling miserable, and then it starts to permeate through. And you might have noticed that in the workplace, or again with your groups of friends, where emotions or seem to sort of get suffused through a group and picked up by everybody else. Yeah, maybe have a think about it. Do see if that works for you. If you say just try it, try and explore it and observe it in the days after you've watched this video. So I said there's been a lot of advances in neuroscience, the science of the brain, and part of that sort of trend, or sorry, part of that explosion of research revealed the existence of mirror neurons. Now, you might have heard of the word empathy, and empathy is variously defined as walking in somebody else's shoes, understanding what they're feeling. But mirror neurons, the discovery of mirror neurons, it seemed to indicate that empathy means that if other people feel things, we feel a little bit of that too. So if other people are feeling happy, we feel a little bit of that too. Now, I haven't got time to go into the neuroscience of this, and any psychologists watching, I do apologise because I'm playing hard and fast with some of the science here, but it's worth looking up. And if you are interested, go and have a look afterwards. But in short, what that means is that for our purposes here, if you witness something, or if you're with somebody, you can feel a little bit of what they're feeling, because the neurons in their brain that trigger when they're feeling upset or happy or sad, they start to trigger similar neurons, these mirror neurons in your own brain. So just to be aware of that. So if you think about that, you can see why people might get really tired and exhausted at the end of the day, because if they're dealing with people who are constantly upset or constantly high or whatever, then their mirror neurons are being triggered. You can see why at the end of the day somebody might feel really, really tired, or very, very worn out, or on the converse, quite happy and up because they've been around people who are quite happy and bouncy all day. Oop, going the wrong way now. There we go. So moving on. So far, I focused on what Hochschild originally focused on, Duncan and Marsden were focusing on, which was the implications for women. The implications for women, both in the workplace and the domestic sphere. Now, that might seem a bit, Mars and Venus, it might seem a bit black and white, might seem a bit binary, really, in a way that perhaps doesn't reflect the modern world. So let's move things forward a bit and ask the question, what about men? So, where do they fit in all this? Well, Hochschild again took that view that occupations that traditionally employed men, majority of those occupations traditionally employed men, and I use the example things like the police and the military, and I know it's different now, but looking back, they employed a different set of kind of emotional labour skills and qualities, which again was about the suppression of emotion. And some feminists particularly, but some sociologists have then explored, well, is that something about the way that men are? Is it a case that women are actually better at emotions? And Hochschild would say it's taken for granted and it's bad that women are not recognised for the emotional labour that they do. But is it the case, as appears to be reflected in quite a few popular narratives, really, open the newspapers, you'll see it all the time, men are emotionally stunted, men are emotionally restricted, men are unable to feel, men cannot care for their partners, all that kind of stuff, I'm exaggerating slightly, but have a look at the way in which it's kind of entered into the sort of popular media, really. And some of you might think that, if you've got many in your life and go, you know what, they're not that good at that emotion stuff, they don't get it, do they? However, what does the research tell us? Have things changed? Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look at where things. Well, in some respects, you know, we've had, well, I don't know how many years of feminism now. How many, how much debate has taken place as to whether gender roles are fixed? You know, are we looking at these sort of false binaries here? You know, what? Yeah, have things changed? Well, yeah, it would seem that in certainly in heterosexual relationships, at least, you know, Matt Munners did an interesting study which suggests that women do approximately 16 hours of household chores every week, while men do closer to 6. Well, I can see this guy, he's doing quite important work texting here, but you can see what the image that I'm trying to portray here. So, okay, so that's sort of domestic chores. That kind of one plank of what Duncan and Marsden were saying was the women's triple shift. What about emotional labour? Has that changed in any way? Have things developed? You know, is the work that Duncan and Marsden did, is the work that Arlie Hochschild did, is it getting a bit sort of long in the tooth? Is it moved? Are things moved on? Are things a bit more fluid now? Are men more emotionally nurturing and caring? Men more emotionally aware? Well, I suppose it depends who you think. Who you talk to, really, and you will have your own views about this. But let's have a look at some couple of bits of interesting research that I've come across, which hopefully you'll find interesting. Now then, are men emotionally restricted? Again, I just highlight the little card on. It's actually from a card again, not constrained by copyright in any way, but just I just thought that kind of illustrated the point that many people try and make about what they see as men's general ineptitude when it comes to feeling towards others and being attuned to other people's feelings. Well, is that really the case? Well, Holmes found a more interestingly complex picture. And what Mary Holmes identified is that for many men, and this is men in heterosexual relationships, what they were doing is they were engaging what she called, you know, reflexivity. So they were aware of emotions and actually trying to, and emotions of their partners and friends and so on, but were kind of engaging in a process, not always kind of, you know, thinking about, so what do I do here, guys? Yeah, engaging in this process of trying to work out the best thing to do, you know, not always getting it right, but at least trying to engage with that process, you know. Sometimes they were doing that automatically. Do what, you know, what's appropriate here? Do I give this person a hug? You know, not kind of from a really stilted perspective, but just trying to work out what the right thing to do is, which I guess for all of us, men, women, you know, it's quite complicated, however we identify and so on, whether we identify as any particular, you know, anywhere on a kind of gender spectrum, working out the right thing to do is quite complicated. So without wishing to be too restrictive about, you know, men and women, let's look at some, again, interesting comments that were made by Tile in 2020. And what's highlighted here is, again, looking at men and what they did. What was highlighted in that research was that men were not actually, the confusion here was, again, whether men are emotionally restricted or just or emotionally repressed, or whether they were doing something else when it came to emotional labour. And what this research suggested is this term, which I quite like, which is emotional compression. So it wasn't just the case that, you know, men didn't feel or were aware or unaware. It's that what they were suggesting here was that men are aware of other people's feelings and emotions, including their own. But again, linking through to what Holmes was saying about so this reflexivity, what they were doing is they were kind of taking the sharp edges off it. So they were looking at this idea of compression. So being aware that there were certain things that you you perhaps shouldn't do or couldn't do, not just for themselves, not just because they didn't know what to do, but because they were aware that it might be not appropriate. So it might not be, so people might feel upset, or they might feel distressed, or they might feel angry. It's just that they didn't show it. So they, or they showed it in a way which was, using the term here was pro-social, which was again aware about the impact on other people. So that is a very brief summary of where we are in relation to this topic. So let's move ahead. Let's have a look at what will happen next, and what do you think? Well, if we want to talk in a bit more detail about this, I suggest you come on the sociology or the sociology with criminology program. Or actually any of our other programs, because we do look at this stuff in quite a lot of detail in a way that hopefully will enable you to form your own views, because our job here is not to teach you what to think. So we don't try and drill stuff into you, say, yeah, this is the way you should think about this stuff. What we're trying to do with our programs is to introduce some concepts which hopefully will have resonance or have impact or interest for you, and then enable you to form or to support your own views by bringing in other information that you might not necessarily be aware of. That's what we think good education is all about. And that's why I hope that you'll be very happy with doing your course at the University of Chichester. Now, that's all I'm going to say for now, except for the fact that if you've got any questions about any of these topics, if you've got any questions about the programs, then please do contact us. Don't feel in any way shy about doing that or reticent. That's what we do here. We're more than happy to speak to you individually and or to show you around the campus and buy a cup of tea and have a talk, at least when we're allowed to, once the restrictions are lifted. So hopefully that wasn't too quick. It was just right size for you to get your heads around an idea which we think is relevant to a whole range of different disciplines, whether it's sociology, criminology, childhood, social work, psychology, a whole range of things. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you.